There's a kind of quiet you can only appreciate after a lifetime of noise. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of chaos. It's the feeling of solid ground under your feet after years of walking on a tightrope over a canyon of drama. For me, that quiet was the most precious thing I had ever built. At 35 years old, my life was finally beautifully, intentionally boring, and I loved every second of it. My world revolved around two brilliant, tiny sons. My eldest, a whirlwind of energy and questions at 5 years old, was just starting to discover the universe in our backyard. Every bug was a new species, every puddle a vast ocean. Watching the world through their eyes was like seeing it in high definition for the first time. Then there was the newest addition, our 6-month-old baby, a little bundle of soft blankets, sleepy sighs, and that intoxicating new baby smell. Their smiles were gummy, their cries were demanding, but their presence had completed our family in a way I hadn't even known was possible. Our home was a sanctuary. It was filled with the gentle hum of a baby monitor, the clatter of dropped building blocks, the sound of my wife humming in the kitchen, and the endless loop of a children's cartoon theme song. These were the sounds of my peace. Every corner of the house was a testament to the life I had so carefully constructed. A life of stability, of predictability, of unconditional love. It was everything I never had, and it was all that mattered. To protect this sanctuary, I had built a wall, a very high, very thick, and completely non-negotiable wall. On the other side of that wall was my mother, Eleanor Ross. For the past 5 years, a strict zero-tolerance, no-contact protocol had been in effect. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was one I made with the certainty of a man who knows exactly what he's protecting his family from. I cut the cord completely. No phone calls, no emails, no letters. Any gifts sent were returned to sender unopened. Any attempts to reach me through relatives were met with a polite but firm shutdown. My friends, the few who knew the full story, understood. My wife, my rock and my partner in building this peaceful life, supported me unconditionally. She had only met Eleanor a handful of times before the wall went up, but it was enough for her to see the storm system I had described. The constant need for attention, the subtle manipulations, the way every conversation somehow twisted back to her and her perceived grievances. She saw the emotional black hole, and she knew our family couldn't risk getting pulled into its orbit. To the outside world, it probably seemed harsh, cruel even, a son cutting off his own mother. But they didn't know Eleanor. They didn't know what it was like to grow up with a person whose moods were the weather system that dictated every single day of your life. Sunny and warm, 1 minute a Category 5, hurricane the next with no warning and no discernible cause. They didn't know the feeling of constantly being on edge, of learning to read the subtle shifts in tone and expression, just to brace for the inevitable emotional impact. My childhood wasn't a series of happy memories. It was a collection of survival strategies. I became an expert in de-escalation. I learned how to make myself small and invisible to avoid becoming a target. I learned that love was conditional, and affection was a currency to be earned and spent, often on things that only benefited her. My accomplishments were her bragging rights. My failures were her personal disappointments, a reflection on her. It was never about me. It was always, always about her. She was a vortex of need, and I had spent the first 18 years of my life just trying not to be sucked in. Leaving for university at 18 wasn't just about getting an education. It was an escape. It was the first time I could breathe air that wasn't thick with her emotional static. The distance helped. For years, I maintained a carefully managed, low-contact relationship with her, keeping our conversations superficial and our visits short. I was building my own life brick by brick, and I knew she couldn't be a part of the foundation. Then 5 years ago, I became a father. Holding my first child, I felt a surge of protective instinct so primal it was terrifying. It was a physical sensation, a shield materializing around my heart. In that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that the cycle of dysfunction had to end with me. It was no longer just about protecting myself. It was about protecting this innocent child who deserved a childhood, not a survival course. The decision to go full no contact was the easiest hard decision I've ever had to make. The birth of our second child 6 months ago had only deepened my resolve. Holding my new baby, I felt that same wave of fierce protectiveness, but this time it was magnified. I was the guardian of a complete family, and my duty to protect them from the toxicity of my past felt more sacred than ever. The joy was immense, but it was tinged with a hyper-vigilance I couldn't shake. Having more to love meant having more to lose. The quiet felt more precious, but also more fragile. It was like I was holding a perfect, delicate glass sculpture I had spent years crafting, terrified that one tremor from the outside world could shatter the whole thing. I would sometimes find myself just watching them. My 5-year-old sprawled on the floor, meticulously arranging toy cars into a traffic jam, narrating the entire scene. My infant asleep in the bassinet, their tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm of pure peace. In those moments, my heart would swell with a love so profound it physically ached, and a cold dread would snake its way up my spine. The ghost of my mother, Eleanor, was always there just outside the walls, a threat I had contained but not eliminated. For 5 years, the wall had held, but I knew her. I knew her relentless self-serving nature, and I had this gnawing feeling deep in my gut that the quiet was too good to last. I just didn't know that the storm was already gathering and it was heading directly for us. The storm arrived on a Saturday morning. It was one of those rare, perfect days that feel like a gift. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of coffee and pancakes hung in the house, a warm, comforting blanket. My 5-year-old was at the small table in the corner, deep in concentration, building a ridiculously tall tower out of colorful blocks. Every few seconds he'd look up at me with a grin, silently demanding I witness his architectural genius. Our 6-month-old was in her high chair, happily gumming a teething toy, her big, curious eyes following my every move. My wife was humming along to some soft music on the radio, flipping a pancake with the effortless grace that I fell in love with a decade ago. This was it. This was the life I had built. Not out of spite or rebellion, but out of a deep, desperate need for normalcy, for peace. Every laugh from my son, every gurgle from my daughter was a brick in the fortress I had constructed around our family. A fortress designed to keep the chaos of my own upbringing from ever touching them. For 5 years, the walls had been impenetrable. The silence from my mother, Eleanor, had been the mortar that held everything together. I had allowed myself to believe foolishly that the silence was permanent, that she had finally accepted the boundary, that she had moved on. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the morning's harmony. I glanced at my wife, a questioning look on my face. We weren't expecting anyone. Saturday mornings were sacred, our time to disconnect from the world and just be a family. My son's block tower wobbled precariously. "I'll get it," I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel. I walked to the front door, a mild flicker of annoyance in my chest. Probably a package delivery or a neighbor. I opened the door, a casual, friendly smile already forming on my lips. The man on the porch did not smile back. He was nondescript, dressed in a polo shirt and slacks that looked like they'd seen better days. He held a clipboard and a thick manila envelope. He looked past me into my home, his eyes briefly registering the scene in the kitchen before flicking back to my face. "Are you Axel Ross?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I am," I said, my smile faltering. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he consulted his clipboard, made a small check mark with a pen, and then extended the thick envelope toward me. "You've been served," he said with all the feeling of someone announcing the time. The words hung in the air, heavy and alien. "Served, I've been served." My mind went blank. It felt like a line from a movie, something that happens to other people in other lives. I must have just stared at him, my hand frozen in mid-air because he gave the envelope a little shake. "You need to take this," he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. My fingers closed around the surprisingly heavy envelope. It was cool to the touch. The man turned without another word and walked down the path to a beat-up sedan parked at the curb. He got in and drove away, leaving me standing in the doorway holding a package that felt like it was radiating cold. "Who was it, honey?" my wife called from the kitchen. I couldn't answer. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. My heart had started to beat a heavy, slow, dread-filled rhythm against my ribs. I looked down at the envelope. My name and address were typed on a label. In the top left corner, there was a return address, a law firm I'd never heard of, and below it, the words that made the floor drop out from under me: re-petition for grandparental visitation. It was like a punch to the gut, stealing all the air from my lungs. My vision narrowed. The cheerful sounds from the kitchen, my son now making car noises, my daughter babbling, faded into a distant buzz. The only thing that was real was the envelope in my hand, and the name that I knew with sickening certainty was inside. Eleanor. I walked back into the kitchen, my movements stiff, robotic. My wife took one look at my face, and her smile vanished. "Axel." "What is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Worse, I managed to say, my voice raspy. I placed the envelope on the kitchen island like it was a venomous snake. "It's from her." She didn't need to ask who her was. In our house, there was only one her. She came over and stood beside me, her hand finding mine. We stared at the envelope together, a silent, unified front against the invasion. For a full minute, neither of us moved. It felt like if we didn't open it, the contents weren't real. If we just left it there, it might somehow vanish, a bad dream dissipating with the morning sun. But it didn't vanish. It sat there, a cancer on our kitchen island, a declaration of war delivered to our front door. With a deep breath, I tore open the flap. My hands were shaking, a fine tremor that started in my fingers and radiated up my arms. I pulled out a thick stack of papers stapled together, filled with dense, intimidating legal text. The top page was a summons commanding my appearance in family court, and beneath it was the petition itself. I started to read. The language was cold, formal, but the story it told was a work of pure fiction. It was a fantasy, a carefully constructed narrative written by a stranger who had never lived a day of my life, but was now claiming to know its deepest truths. It was my mother's voice filtered through the sterile prose of a lawyer. The petitioner, Eleanor Ross, age 60, it read, a loving and devoted grandmother has been unjustly and cruelly denied access to her beloved grandchildren. It claimed she had a deep and pre-existing bond with them. It painted a picture of a benevolent matriarch yearning to shower her grandchildren with affection, only to be blocked by her cold and unreasonable son. A sound escaped my throat, a choked, bitter laugh that was closer to a sob. A pre-existing bond. She had never met them. Not once. She had never held my son. She had never seen my daughter. She didn't know the color of their eyes, the sound of their laughter, their favorite bedtime stories. She didn't know that my son was obsessed with dinosaurs, or that my daughter only fell asleep when you hummed a specific lullaby. She knew nothing. She had forfeited the right to know anything 5 years ago when I told her in no uncertain terms that she would not be a part of my children's lives. The lies kept coming, page after page. Each one was a twisting knife. It alleged that I was acting out of spite, that I was using my children as pawns in a personal vendetta. It mentioned her impeccable character and her stable, loving home. Impeccable character. The woman was a convicted felon, a fact conveniently omitted from her fairy tale. Stable, loving home. I grew up in that home. It was a psychological minefield, a place where love was a weapon and stability was a foreign concept. My grip on the papers tightened, my knuckles turning white. I could feel the rage building inside me, a hot, familiar tide rising in my chest. This was her signature move. It always had been. She didn't just disagree with your reality. She erased it and wrote her own, and then demanded that everyone else read from her script. She was the hero, the victim, the long-suffering saint. Anyone who contradicted her narrative was the villain. Growing up, I was often cast in that role. The difficult child, the ungrateful son, the source of all her problems. I had spent my entire adult life escaping that script. I had built a new story for myself, a true one, filled with genuine love and real peace. And now here she was, trying to drag me back into her twisted production, with my children cast as the newest props. My wife read the documents over my shoulder, her breath catching at the sheer audacity of the claims. "Axel," she said softly, her voice laced with steel, "this is insane." "This is her," I replied, my voice dangerously low. "This is who she is. She can't stand that we're happy without her. She can't stand that she doesn't have control. This isn't about the kids. It's never been about anyone but her. She sees them as a second chance. Not to be a better grandmother, but to get a better son. A do-over. And she will burn our entire world to the ground to get what she wants." The sanctuary I had built felt like it was crumbling. The peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the cold, metallic taste of fear. The walls of my home suddenly felt thin, permeable. She had reached through them all the way from whatever life she was living and had planted a bomb in the middle of my kitchen. The ticking was deafening. I looked over at my children. My son had finally placed the last block on his tower. It stood tall and precarious, a monument to his innocent, focused joy. He looked at me, his face beaming with pride. "Daddy, look. It's the biggest ever." My daughter was watching him, a gummy smile on her face. In their world, everything was safe. Everything was simple. They were protected. They had no idea that a legal battle was about to begin for the right to their own childhoods. They didn't know that the monster from my past was no longer a ghost I kept at bay with silence and distance. She had a name on a legal document. She had a court date. She had found a way to make herself real again. The fight I thought I had won 5 years ago, the day I went no contact, was a lie. It was just a ceasefire. And Eleanor had just launched a full-scale invasion. This wasn't just an attack on me anymore. It was an attack on my family, on my son, on my daughter. She was trying to use the law to force her way into their lives, to poison their peace with the same toxicity that had defined my own. A cold, hard resolve settled over me, extinguishing the initial shock and fear. It was replaced by a clarity so sharp it hurt. She wanted a fight. She had brought the war to my doorstep. Fine. But she was mistaken if she thought I was still that 15-year-old boy who could only watch helpless as her chaos reigned. I was 35 now. I was a husband. I was a father. And the man I had become would go to any length and any depth to protect his family. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had forgotten what I knew about her. She had forgotten the secrets she thought were buried by time. And I would dig up every single one of them to make sure she never, ever got near my children. The battle for their future had just begun. The first call I made was to a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but the best, most ruthless family law attorney in the city. I walked into his office the next day, the cursed documents in my hand, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I laid out the entire story. 20 years of history compressed into a single, harrowing hour. I didn't sugarcoat my mother's abuse. I didn't minimize her instability. I painted the full picture, ending with the 5 years of blessed silent peace she had just shattered. The lawyer, a man with tired eyes that had seen every kind of family warfare, listened without interruption. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "She's filed for grandparental visitation. In this state, that's a high bar to clear. She has to prove a pre-existing beneficial relationship with the children and that the loss of this relationship would cause them harm. From what you're telling me, she's never even met them." "Never," I confirmed. "The no-contact protocol has been in place since my son was born 5 years ago. My daughter is 6 months old. She's a biological and legal stranger to them." "Then her case is built on lies," he said, nodding slowly. "The court will likely order mediation first, and attempt to find a compromise." I felt a surge of ice water in my veins. No, The word was flat, final. There is no compromise. There is no supervised visit. There is no one-time meeting for a photograph. The answer isn't maybe later. The answer is never. My job is to protect my children, and my mother is the single greatest threat to their safety I have ever known. We are not mediating. We are ending this. My lawyer studied me for a long moment, and a flicker of something respect maybe passed through his eyes. "All right," he said, his tone shifting from procedural to strategic. "If we're not defending, we're attacking. We need to prove to the court not just that she has no relationship with them, but that she is fundamentally unfit to ever have one. We need to discredit her so completely that no judge would ever risk placing a child in her orbit." "I have what you need," I said, my voice low. "She thinks it's buried. She thinks after 20 years it doesn't matter anymore." I leaned forward. "I want you to file a subpoena for the full unredacted county archival records. Criminal court. The case of the state versus Eleanor Ross." He raised an eyebrow. "A 20-year-old case." "Felony embezzlement," I said. "It's the key. It's not just my word against hers anymore. It's her own history on public record, documented and undeniable. It's the proof." The hunt for that document became my obsession. It felt like we were pulling a ghost from its grave. Weeks were spent on legal filings and requests. Eleanor's lawyer tried to block it, calling it an irrelevant, prejudicial smear campaign designed to assassinate the character of a loving grandmother. But my lawyer argued successfully that any evidence pertaining to a person's character and trustworthiness was directly relevant when the welfare of minors was at stake. The day the file arrived at his office, he called me immediately. It was a thick manila folder heavy with the weight of the past. Inside, on brittle yellowing paper, was the official judgment, the cold, hard facts of her crime. Certified, stamped, real. Holding it in my hands, I felt a grim sense of power. This wasn't just a legal document. This was a weapon. And in the courtroom, I was prepared to use it. The day of the hearing arrived. I sat beside my lawyer, my back rigid, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. Eleanor was across the room, seated next to her own counsel. She was dressed in a soft pastel sweater, set looking every bit the gentle, harmless 60-year-old woman. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a perfect performance of a heartbroken grandmother. When she took the stand, her voice was soft, trembling with feigned emotion. She told the judge a beautiful story. A story of a devoted mother who, through a tragic misunderstanding, had been cruelly cut out of her son's life. She spoke of the deep, aching void in her heart where her grandchildren should be. She claimed she had tried everything, phone calls, letters, gifts, all returned unopened. She painted me as cold, unforgiving, and cruel, punishing her for long past mistakes that were, in her words, just a part of any normal family's ups and downs. "I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago." She wept, looking directly at the judge. "I've grown. I've changed. All I want is a chance to know them, to bake cookies, to read them stories, to give them the love that every grandmother should be able to give. Is that so much to ask?" Her performance was flawless. I could see the judge's expression softening with sympathy. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was her superpower, convincing the world that her version of reality was the only one that existed. Then my lawyer stood up for the cross-examination. He approached her calmly, his demeanor gentle. He asked her a few simple questions. "Mrs. Ross, you believe you are a person of good moral character, correct?" "Yes, of course," she said, straightening up slightly. "And you would agree that a person's ability to be trusted, especially around money and responsibility, is important when considering the welfare of children?" "Absolutely," she said confidently. My lawyer walked back to our table and picked up the heavy manila folder. He approached the clerk. "I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit A, a certified copy of a felony conviction from the county criminal court dated 20 years ago." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Eleanor's face went pale. Her lawyer shot to his feet, objecting, but the judge, her curiosity now piqued, waved him down. "I'll allow it. Proceed." My lawyer placed the document in front of my mother. "Mrs. Ross, could you please identify this record for the court?" She stared at it, her hands trembling. She couldn't speak. "Allow me to help you," my lawyer said, his voice turning from gentle to razor sharp. "This is a record of your conviction on the charge of felony embezzlement. Is that correct?" She mumbled something incoherent. "Speak up, please, Mrs. Ross. Is this your conviction record?" "Yes," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "And this conviction," my lawyer continued, his voice now booming in the silent room, "was for stealing over $50,000 from a youth sports league, a fund meant to pay for uniforms, equipment, and travel for children. Is that also correct?" She just stared at him, her mask of victimhood shattering into a million pieces. He wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "And Mrs. Ross, this youth sports league, your own son, Axel. Ross was a participant in that league, was he not? He was a player on one of the teams you stole from." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The judge's eyes widened, her gaze snapping from the document to Eleanor, then to me. My lawyer delivered the final, devastating blow. "Tell the court, Mrs. Ross, how old was your son Axel when you, his mother, were convicted of stealing from his own childhood activities? How old was the boy who had to watch his mother get arrested, shamed in the local paper, and branded a felon for robbing him and his friends?" The silence was absolute. Eleanor crumpled in on herself, the pastel sweater suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She couldn't look at the judge. She couldn't look at me. She just stared at the document on the stand in front of her, the ghost I had summoned from the past. Finally, she choked out the answer. He was 15. The courtroom felt like a vacuum. All the air had been sucked out of it. The judge stared at my mother, her earlier sympathy replaced by a look of profound disgust. It was over. Every lie Eleanor had told, every claim of being a stable, loving, trustworthy person had been incinerated by a single 20-year-old piece of paper. Her credibility was not just damaged, it was annihilated. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. I just felt a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. This was my mother, and I had just been forced to publicly prove to a court of law that she was a thief and a liar, unfit to be near my children. It was a necessary act of protection, but it felt like an amputation. I had to cut off a part of my own history to save my family's future. The judge cleared her throat, her voice cold and heavy. "This court has heard enough. The evidence presented in Exhibit A is damning. It speaks directly to the petitioner's character or lack thereof. We will adjourn, and I will deliver my ruling." We didn't have to wait long. When the judge returned, her face was a stony mask of resolution. She looked directly at Eleanor. "The petition for grandparental visitation is hereby dismissed with prejudice." The words hit like a gavel. With prejudice meant she could never file again. Ever. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, her gaze shifting to me, "This court finds that the petitioner's actions, both past and present, represent a significant risk of harm to the emotional and psychological well-being of the minor children. Therefore, this court grants the respondent's counter-petition." She lifted a document from her desk. "A permanent, non-expiring civil restraining order is issued against Eleanor Ross, effective immediately. She is forbidden from attempting to contact, harass, or come within 500 yards of Axel Ross or his minor children. This order will remain in effect for the remainder of her life, for the rest of her life." The finality of it washed over me. It was a shield, a permanent, legally binding wall around my family that she could never breach. The war was over. I had won. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, blinking like I was emerging from a long, dark cave. The weight that had been crushing me for the last 4 months was gone. I drove home, the restraining order, a simple piece of paper that held so much power, on the passenger seat beside me. When I walked through my front door, the first thing I saw was my 5-year-old son on the floor, building another magnificent, wobbly tower of blocks. My 6-month-old daughter was in her bouncy seat, watching him with a look of pure adoration. The peace in the room was so thick, so real, I could feel it. This was what I had been fighting for, this quiet, beautiful, ordinary moment. My son looked up and saw me, his face breaking into a huge grin. "Daddy, you're home." I knelt down on the floor and he scrambled into my arms, hugging me tightly. I buried my face in his hair, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, and for the first time in months, I felt my entire body relax. The monster was gone. The ghosts were banished. The sanctuary was secure. I had broken the cycle. My children would never have to know the chaos I had known. Their childhoods were safe. And that victory was worth any price.